Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Mike Okwoche. The past 10 days in Ethiopia was not strange in any way as the country witnessed a busier airport, fully booked hotels, entourage of government delegations and closed-door sessions. The 22nd African Union Summit in Addis Ababa kicked off with AU heads of state launching 2014 as the year of agriculture and food security. But the safety of lives on the continent dominated talks, with leaders expressing concern over the conflicts in Egypt, South Sudan and the Central African Republic. Next on the order of events is the AU Donors Conference to raise funds for humanitarian aid and peacekeeping operations in the Central African Republic. But what do you make of the African Union's response to issues affecting the continent? Share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC Africa Today, or send an email to africatoday@tvcnews.tv and you will be heard, certainly. We'll take a report from the summit and Africa Today will be right back. Thanks for joining us.
We are still importing a lot of food. We're still spending about 15 billion importing food, but there are success stories scattered around the continent where countries are beginning to turn the tide in terms of producing their own food and eating what they produce, and of course also exporting. I think we should also be looking at where Africa is producing certain products for the world to see how we can influence the pricing of those products. Part of celebrating our 50th anniversary, we decided that part of the celebration is to look back over the past 50 years, but also to begin to look forward into the next 50 years, and that we should really take our destiny in our hands. And we can only do that if we plan ahead. And planning ahead assists you to dream beyond your immediate circumstances and to make you, in a way, go beyond that and say, in 50 years, I want to be there. And then work backwards and say, how do I get there? And what would be the landmarks? Because if we just planned for 5 years, then we will be very much influenced by our immediate situation.
Right, now the one-year rotating chair of the African Union passed from Ethiopia's Haile Mariam Desalegn to Mauritania's President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz. Now, he became the president of this country in 2009 after leading 2 coups in 4 years. Now, to discuss the African Union, we have Gatima Liman, former 2007 presidential candidate in Nigeria and an African affairs expert. It's good to have you join us today.
It's a pleasure, sir.
And let me say Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. We haven't seen each other yet.
You're welcome.
Well.
And then later on the show, we'll be linking up with TVC News Eastern Africa correspondent Ken Karuri. He'll be joining us from the summit, AU summit going on in Ethiopia. Let's start this way. Political instability. There's so many issues affecting the African continent, however, but the heads of states have decided to choose food security as one of the focal points for the summit and 2014 as a year. Why food security, amongst other things?
I think the American-US delegation that was there actually hit the nail right at the head and said, look, you could talk about food security, but you also have conflicts on ground, which will definitely affect the stability that is required for you to deal with the agricultural challenges and all that. So you're absolutely right that we have real serious conflicts in the key regions, particularly Central Africa, Egypt, even Nigeria, even Nigeria, of course, the northern parts of the country where it's supposed to be an agri enclave and things like that. So it's a wonderful, pious expectation as to what you want to do in terms of food security. You just had the head of the African Union Commission saying that we still do import tremendous amount of food from overseas. And any region of the world that cannot feed itself, it's actually a strategic weakness. Yes.
Now, how would you assess AU's response to conflicts on the continent? Because that's really very touching.
You needed to understand that Africa as a continent had gone through a lot of difficulties. Let's go back a little bit in time: slavery, the partition of Africa, and colonialism, then post-colonial era. Indeed, you could say Africa never really had its own opportunity to govern itself. And so therefore, it has fallen within the sphere of influence of various big powers. And that explains to you the real major sources of conflict vis-a-vis the abundance of resource Africa has. So it's not like it's a continent that has been given the opportunity for it to aspire for its own development agenda as other continents had gone. Other continents had their own challenges, but Africa's own, it's extremely very peculiar and very, very dire. And that's why you've seen even the current re-strategies, the difficulties that you're seeing. Its Soviet Union had gone before it was the non-aligned nations. Africans had said, look, we don't want to be part of these big power game calculations. We're non-aligned. So if the Soviet Union comes with better programs, we'll be with them. If the US comes with big, or the European Union comes with a good program, we'll be with them. And so after some times, you had the fizzling out of the Soviet Union, as it were. What you're now seeing, it's a arrangement of the chessboard. China has come very strong into the African continent. And so a lot of those traditional partners, France, the former colonial masters, so say Britain, USA, and all those, will be able to look at what is on the ground right now and the likely scenario that this is going to vis-a-vis their investments. Exactly. And because Africa is a very, very wealthy, resource-rich continent. And so what happens within Africa can only be understood when you look beyond the African continent and see the big-time players that do come into the power calculations and all that.
Okay, let me ask this on a lighter note. At the summit, tributes were paid to late Nelson Mandela.
May he so rest in peace.
Exactly. And then Robert Mugabe was made one of the vice presidents of the AU.
Yes.
One would say, what a contrast.
No, not contrast. You see, the Africans themselves know that the person giving you a red paint, they know the history of Zimbabwe. They also know the history of the independence struggle, by Robert Mugabe and all this. So it depends on which side of the spectrum that you are. If you are on the side of the spectrum of Africans that have come out from this apartheid regime where Mandela himself was one time termed a terrorist, only for him to become a war leader and things like that. So it depends on the level of development. And also it's not surprising that his colleagues will appreciate him, even though he himself over the years had, in terms of taking a very draconian position, he has taken a softer position in some of his policies, and he's gradually seeing that there is need for you to have a positive engagement with the international community and all that kind of. So perhaps that's a way of bringing him into the wider cycle.
Okay. Yes. Well, we're trying to establish links with from the AU summit, but certainly when we establish link, we'll let you know how that's going. But let me ask this: amongst African AU states, they don't really trade between themselves. What is responsible for this?
This is what I'm saying, the overwhelming influence of the history, the colonial structures in place.
But the continent is realizing now, trying to deviate a little from the concept of importation and so on. But the first point of call should be, let's trade amongst ourselves.
Yeah, but you see there are a lot of institutional arrangements in place, structural arrangements that had existed, predated the coming of independence, for instance. Let's take the case of Nigeria, for instance, in terms of foreign trade. We're still practicing foreign trade based on the economic model that we inherited from the UK, the British Empire, so to say. Our exports are predominantly, for instance, free on board, and the imports are cost, insurance, and freight. When you look at it, the transport element, which you are now saying, for instance, it leans towards the former metropolitan economies of Europe and all that. And so a lot of these linkages and institutional arrangements still make it possible for a person in Jamaica, for instance, to fly to Paris before he goes to South Africa.
Exactly.
You know, and it requires structural changes. And African nations, independent African nations, never really had the golden opportunity for them post-independence to do those structural changes that they wanted to do in mind, because the possession in the world at most times is a zero-sum game.
Okay, but what would it take to, you talked about structural changes, what would it take to make amends on such
A
kind
lot
of
of funds.
changes now?
You know, developments require three key components in development. You need the skill level, the technology, the manpower. That's the man, the concept. You also need money. A lot of, you're talking about intervention. Again, I saw the US delegation was asked about the contribution they make into South Africa, the Central African crisis. They're talking about $100 million for that kind of humongous thing. They're now talking about launching donor conference. What is it telling you? It's telling you that African nations are still very poor nations because of the terms of trade. In the international trade, most African nations are exporting raw commodities, you know, and importing finished products. So internationally, they've not been doing well in spite of some kind of, positive sweeteners here and there where you see one or two countries doing well in one or two segments. But on the aggregate, you have not seen robust development in terms of what they can do in the world stage that makes them to have the funds for them to do those structurally institutional changes that you want to take. Like for instance, if we are talking about aviation industry, you need to have the aircraft, the fleet, the size of the fleet. You know, you need to also have particularly the fuel that can aviation fuel, quite expensive and all that.
You also need the hangars as well.
Yeah, hangars and all this kind of thing. And you
on.
also need to realize that the competition is already on ground. The British Airways, the French lines, the Lufthansas and all this in place. They're going to say, because you're African, we're going to just
patronize African.
So these are some of the real structural realities on ground. You know.
Okay. Now, China was responsible for building the magnificent AU headquarters in Addis Ababa. But when it comes to foreign interests on Africa, how would you rate the interest on Africa from outside?
Well, Africa, as I said, it's a resource-rich continent, and so there is, for the foreseeable time in future, you're going to see a lot of intervention. You know, whether it's coming from Soviet Union or the the United States or the European Union or China. And so I am seeing a lot of foray being made by Chinese, and as a consequence of that, you've seen that most of the traditional players, the big powers, Western powers, were during the time when the Western powers' mind was, concentrated on the Soviet Union and all that. China had a golden opportunity to have an inroad. Now that the challenge is no longer Soviet Union, you can see Barack Obama came on an African tour to say that, America, we've been a little bit slow in coming to the new Africa, so we're going to get Africa engaged. So I'm not surprised, for instance, that they sent about 10-man delegation to the Addis Ababa conference and all that kind of a thing. So you're going to see a lot of interest because most of these developed economies are in dire need of raw material, particularly oil and gas. And Angola, Ghana, Equatorial Guinea, the Gulf of Guinea I'm talking about, Chad, Niger, and all these places are now new discoveries of oil, and that is bringing in a lot of geopolitics.
All this interest coming into the continent, would you say this interest are going to be 50-50 for the benefit of Africa?
No, they will not be 50-50, because you see, even in negotiations, that you're talking about trade negotiations, you need a lot of expertise. Okay. One or two of the trade clauses that you don't understand may eventually commit a nation to a number of years, and there's nothing you can do because you've signed on, you've seen what had happened to Nigerian case with the Bakassi, for instance. So you need to have real eggheads that understand the international geopolitics in part of the negotiation. So you're not going to see a 50-50 negotiation. Like for instance, I was quite interested in. I saw the Chad, Cameroon, Niger pipeline with the crude being loaded in the Kribi port of Cameroon, for instance. Surprisingly, when I was looking at the parity, you had 3% by the government and 40% by some of the foreign investors and all that kind of thing. Yes.
Sorry, we'll have to go for a break now. All right, we'll take a short break, and Africa Today will be right back. Stay with us. All right, thanks for staying with us on Africa Today. Now we have an international correspondent from Addis Ababa joining us now, Ken Kariri. Ken, it's good to have you join us. Now, what are the major issues at the 22nd AU Summit? Can you give us a brief?
Yes, indeed, Mike, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, the 22nd African Head of State Union Summit has just drawn to a close here in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, about an hour ago. And we had the new AU Assembly Chairperson, who is also Mauritania's President Mohamed Abdel Aziz, reading out some of the resolutions that the leaders have agreed upon. And the first and foremost was the establishment of what you might say is an African standby force. And this will be very critical in ensuring that it can be sent to areas that are still plagued by conflict. Secondly, there was a call by the African leaders to ensure that they fight together the threat of terrorism that is plaguing many countries. For instance, Kenya, where there is Al-Shabaab, as well as in Somalia. In Nigeria, there is Boko Haram. And all that threat of increased terrorism to ensure that the continent is safe. Thirdly was the issue of the training on the youth. They say Africa's youth have not been trained well, and that's why they need, they need to be given a new set of training that will enable them kickstart or rather help them realize the dream of the Agenda 2063, which calls for a prosperous Africa. And fourthly, which was the last point which the union agreed, as well as the members here agreed, was for Africa to stand together in international affairs on issues to do with climate change, as well as on the trade, and also on the on the UN. So a set of resolutions here which have been read by the new AU chairperson, Mike.
All right. Now, 2014 was set aside or made the year of agriculture on the continent. Now, why did they choose agriculture to be the focal point for Africa this year?
Yeah, very good question, Mike. And we had the AU Commission chairperson, that's Dr. Dlamini Zuma, saying that 2014 had been declared as the year when Africa will kickstart an agrarian revolution. And the idea behind this is that for Africa to be able to move to where it's posting 7% GDP growth all across the borders in the in the continent, then for the African nations must be committing, or rather the respective governments must be committing at least 10% of their budgets, of their GDP budgets, to agriculture. That is the only way they can be able to do that. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's about 10 or so countries which are doing that, and they're saying that for Africa to be able to move in a way where they are secure, where they can be able to look for opportunities on trade, growing infrastructure, they must first of all feed the 1 billion plus population. At the moment, statistics are very grim worldwide. They show that 1 out of 3 people who are malnourished are actually in Africa. And that's why the African Union decided 2014 was the year for agriculture and food security.
All right, Agenda 2063 is the AU's blueprint for the next 50 years. What strategies are they putting in place to achieve all the set goals for the next 50 years?
Well, Mike, they've actually put a number of policies for the continent, and key among them is stability. They've actually said that they're aiming by the year 2020 there will be the sound of gun. The sound of gun will actually be off, will be silent in the whole continent. And that way, the only way Africa can start developing its infrastructure, developing the people so that they can be able to create businesses, do farming, is for all the guns to fall silent. Then from there, they can look at ways where Africa can partner with international corporations to be able to maximize the resources that it has. For instance, CAR, which is plagued by the conflicts, is rich with gold, but unfortunately, they're not tapping into that resource. So for the African Union, they're saying that the Agenda 2063, Africa must stand together, must remain committed, must fight to ensure the base stability so that it can be able to prosper and become a continent that is able to fight it off with other continents in the world.
All right. Now, what are AU's specific plans to settle the issues in the South Sudan and the Central African Republic? Were there any precise decisions on that?
Mike, the theme for this conference was was food security and agriculture, but unfortunately, it was completely overshadowed by the ongoing conflict in Central African Republic as well as in South Sudan. The African Union leaders came out very strongly and they said that they will not support any conflict, any rebellion in the continent. For instance, they said that South Sudan, they still consider President Salva Kiir as a duly elected president, and they're not going to allow the toppling of democratically elected governments. So in a way, they are very keen. They're saying that if anybody has a problem, they can either use the courts or wait until when the elections are due. But for South Sudan, they're also insisting that there will be long-term solutions, and they're keen to ensure that the 4 detainees who are still remaining, already 7 have been released to the custody of Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta. They're saying the 4 who are still being held must be released to ensure that there is long-lasting peace as well as a long-lasting solution for the crisis in South Sudan. While for the Central African Republic, they also committed there'll be a conference tomorrow where countries will be contributing money to help in the peace process that is going to take place in Central African Republic, as well as for more troops will be laid on the ground to ensure that Bangui is no longer a conflict-prone area.
All right, Ken, thank you very much for giving us a heads up on that. Thank you. All right, now the AU Commission Chairperson Dlamini Zuma saw Africa. According in her words, she said Africa is going to be a hub for manufacturing in the next 50 years, and even predicted the likely African kind of Silicon Valley in Rwanda, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on. But in your own view, are these likely goals that can be achieved in 50 years?
They're very optimistic, positive goals that can actually be achieved. Okay. As long as we first and foremost reduce the level of guns, on ground. And that can only come when you realize that the African population basically is a youthful population. The predominant size of the pie, the population, it's actually something between the ages of 14 to about 30, which means, therefore, that these are very agitated minds, and you needed the agricultural sector, which really engages huge volume of the idle hands to really be put on ground, which is exactly what the African Union has done. Now, hitherto, Africa's economy was reliant on mineral economy, and the mineral exports, as I've seen, hardly engages 10,000, in a country, maybe not more than 10 to 15,000 people are effectively engaged. Take the case of Nigeria, for instance. What you have, the example of the oil industry. Basically, apart from the other ripple effects that it brings, the oil industry hardly employs beyond 100,000 people. For a country of 150 million or 70 million people, it's just a drop in the ocean. Exactly. So Africans, the strategy of looking 10% of the budget on agricultural sector, I think a big plus. And if Africans can feed very well, and then they can dream very well. Yeah. I mean, India did it, the Silicon Valley thing that you were talking about. It's all started with the people like the Prime Minister Nehru. They had a vision of what India was going to be during the independence struggle in the 40s, 50s, and thereabout. So, but they said, first of all, India has to be self-sufficient in terms of rural development, in terms of food production. So that is key. For them to see that they meet this 50-year dream objective that they have put for themselves.
It's okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming on the program today.
It's a pleasure, sir.
Thank you very much.
It's okay.
And we also thank our correspondent, Ken Karuri, who reached us from the AU Summit in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Now, among the preferred solutions at just concluded AU Summit was the need for economic integration to boost intra-Africa trade from less than 12% in 2013 to 50% by 2045. But as a matter of urgency, leaders must tackle the root causes of conflicts, including diversity, inclusion, and management of resources on the continent. Now, many appreciate the international community's support in addressing security concerns, but insist that ultimate solutions for Africa must come from within. That's our show for today. You can also watch episodes of the show online on youtube.com/TVC Africa Today. And until we come your way again, I am Mike Okwoche. And remember, this is Africa. Bye for now.